Well, in studio, I do have with me Hugh Hacking. He's the Executive Head of Structured Investments and Annuities at Momentum Corporate, and Ruben Johannes, he's the Director for Tax at Deloitte Africa. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Hugh, let me start with you. Of course, the markets are looking at this budget with great anticipation, looking at our debt levels and looking at the budget deficit. Those are variables that will also be looked at very closely by the ratings agencies. What are you hoping that the Minister is going to have to say around this, and are you optimistic that he's managing the promise to stabilize that debt to GDP ratio?
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, Nompu, and the listeners. Look, I think for us as a country and as an economy, it's important that our debt ratings remain at least stable or improve, so that we can retain foreign investments into our assets, and we can retain foreign investors' interest in the economy. So we certainly hope to see some sort of consolidation and stabilization efforts that will improve the debt rating over time. Those will include making sure that government fiscal expenditure is in line with the tax collections and the tax base. In other words, that the government's not spending more than what it collects in taxes. So we are hoping to see, some focus around that, either through making sure that expenses are curtailed, probably employment expenses within the public service itself are looked at, but also making sure that tax collections are managed, and probably looking at taxes in general and just making sure that they remain appropriate. Obviously, nobody wants to see increased taxes, but we will have to see what happens in that respect.
Yeah, Ruben, there's a lot of speculation around tax increases. We've heard about briefings that are being had, to discuss the potential increases in taxes, an emergency meeting that's supposed to be taking place. Whatever the case, whatever is going to happen with tax increases, the SARS Commissioner has already said that sometimes there isn't much merit in increasing major taxes, because that might actually result in a situation where you get less revenue. What's your view around that?
Yeah, thank you, Nompumelelo, and good afternoon to the listeners. You're quite right. So I think the Commissioner referred to their inflection point on the Laffer curve, which talks to where you tax the existing tax base to a point, and when you exceed that point, it actually has the adverse impact of what you're intending to achieve as a result of capital flight or taxpayer behavior changing, and so moving from a behavior of compliance towards non-compliance. And that is the danger one faces with taxing the existing tax base even further.
Yeah, no, it is sounds problematic indeed. And Hugh, just in terms of your industry, the investment industry, one of the things that is key is investment in infrastructure. What is the appetite among you guys to invest in South African infrastructure? Because of course, so much money is needed in that area. Government can't do it alone. There's talk about blended financing, which I suppose speaks to various different people putting their money in there to make sure that these projects come off the ground.
Well, Nompu, infrastructure investing is an interesting and exciting topic for some of us. And, so certainly my opinion is that infrastructural investment is really critical to our economy. We all know that we need infrastructure, and sometimes that needs to be financed, because these are long-running projects that consume large amounts of money. And one of the ways of generating that is to make sure that specifically pension funds are interested in investing into infrastructure, because those are long-term investments, they're there for a long time. And so we certainly hope that there's a focus on improving infrastructure investment in the economy, and that comes commensurate with the frameworks that are needed to ensure that. So, for example, you need to make sure that pension fund rules are aligned, that makes it possible for funds to invest. There needs to be a look at liquidity for pension funds as well, to make sure that when somebody actually leaves the fund, they can get their money out. So that holistic framework does need to be addressed. But we're quite excited. We think that there is a focus on this, and we certainly look forward to some comment on this in the budget.
Yeah, Ruben, what's your view about SARS as an institution now? We know that it had bad flack a few years ago. They've been working very hard to become a better tax administrator. And to the point that we were discussing earlier, it's important that they're capacitated to be able to extract the tax that is owed. According to the SARS Commissioner, there's about 800 billion rands worth of taxes that they still need to extract, that they legally have the right to extract, but for one reason or another that they haven't been able to. But what's your view on their role, and do you think they need more money to be able to be capacitated to do their job?
Yeah, so my view on SARS is that it remains one of the better run state organs of state. Over the years, as you said, there was a period in which SARS was hollowed out and lost capabilities. For the last while now, with the current commission of SARS, there's been a concerted effort at trying to improve that and trying to address that. There's been a concerted effort at looking to use technology to improve SARS revenue collection abilities. In the State of the Nation address, the President mentioned, for instance, that SARS has used artificial intelligence to prohibit or prevent impermissible refunds of some 95 billion rand, and have also used artificial intelligence to collect a further 20 billion rand in taxes. And so in that sense, I think SARS continues to do a good job. There is, of course, still room for improvement, not only Nompumelelo in terms of capacity to collect tax, but also in the what you'd call the customer experience. I think lots of taxpayers still often experience some frustration when dealing with SARS, and that doesn't bode well for tax collection either.
Yeah. So I suppose SARS will have had a bit of a party, with the two-pot system. They did indicate, or they put out a statement at the end of January, that they'd managed to raise quite a bit in terms of their fiscal take. But of course, South Africans tapped onto about 43 billion rand worth of money. Some of that went into consumption. Some of it went into bringing down debt. As a fund manager, how concerned are you that people don't tap onto their funds every single year? And do you think that the two-pot system has managed to address the goal of ensuring that people ultimately preserve their retirement savings for the future?
Well, there's a few questions there. I think the first question is that two-pot has certainly provided a much-needed relief for many consumers. People are under a lot of financial pressure, and so the ability to withdraw a component of their savings certainly does help people. We certainly also advocate for the fact that people need to take a longer-term view around their savings, and so the preservation of the retirement component of the savings, that is really good news, and I think that will put more people in a better situation when they do reach retirement age to have assets available to actually draw down in their retirement. What we do hope is that people don't just withdraw a little bit every year, that people actually do draw down their savings component when it's sort of an emergency or when it's really necessary, because otherwise it will just be a little bit every year rather than if you wait a while and then you actually really need it and you do draw it. So I think it's important for people to have that access when they need it, and so we certainly do hope that people use it prudently and make sure that when they're in real need, that's when they draw. But overall, I think it's fared well. Yes, SARS has benefited from additional tax collections, but one needs to remember that retirement benefits are in any event taxable at some point in time when you do take them. So it's probably just an acceleration of those benefits.
Yeah. So, Ruben, with tax, you get the carrot and you get the stick, and there's a concept of tax incentives. Do you think that government needs to do more to provide tax incentives to, say, the SME sector or other businesses to be able to, spearhead certain parts of the economy to get growth going? Because the biggest cry out there is the lack of funds to get things going, especially for, businesses that have a great idea but not necessarily the resources.
So within our South African tax landscape, we've already got quite a comprehensive range of tax incentives that are provided within the various industries. So if you talk mining, if you talk oil and gas, if you talk specific activities such as research and development. So these incentives do exist. There's always a question mark around how effective those incentives are in terms of driving the right sort of behavior or right sort of outcomes. You'll remember a couple of years ago we had the introduction of the incentive for solar, for instance, which was aimed at driving specific behavior at that stage, which was investment into solar. With the introduction of global minimum tax that we had at the end of 2024, it adds a further layer of complexity to the discussion, because you could end up with a situation where the tax incentives that you introduce result in taxpayers having an effective tax rate of less than 15%, and this would be your large multinationals. And where that happens, they in any case end up have to pay further top-up taxes. And so that is an interesting discussion on its own, and one that would have to be factored in when you're looking at introducing more incentives or not.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much for that, Ruben. Well, we have said goodbye to Hugh Hacking of Momentum Corporate. Thank you very much to him for his insights there. And with us in studio now, I do have Mr. Aluwani Musese. He's the country chair of Shell Downstream South Africa. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. What is it that you're expecting or hoping to come out of the budget speech as it pertains specifically to the oil and gas industry? We know that our Mineral Resources Minister Godongwana has been really championing the idea of more investment in oil and gas. But then on the other hand, of course, the contradicting voices around, we need to be a responsible country around ensuring that we watch our carbon footprint. No doubt there'll be reference to carbon taxes in the budget speech as well. So how do we get that balance right? And of course, we understand that there is an important element there that, if we have resources as African countries, why don't we tap onto them, but do it in a responsible way?
Well, tough questions that you're raising, but I mean, the energy question is always that trilemma that we talk about: access, affordability, and sustainability question that all of us have confronted with. I think when I look at the oil and gas side of things today, majority of our cars are still depending on oil and gas for us to be able to move. So there's no question that we still need to be confronting or investing in making sure that there is that access that is addressed. So we need the infrastructure to be right, which means our ports, our pipelines, the railway lines need to be efficient for us to be able to bring the product where the product needs to be. And then there's the second question, which is really around, where do you invest to make sure that for the future you are then transitioning you are then transitioning, but also making sure that you still have the energy that you need. And in that case, this is when then you have to think about what is the bold move that South Africa is going to make. And everybody talks about gas being, the source of energy that will then be able to help us to transition. But for us to get there, it requires that the Minister of Finance takes on the challenge and then be able to be clear on what is really the investment that the government is going to make, the policy clarity, because these require long-term investments for all of us to be clear in terms of getting there. Then in the last question that you're talking to in terms of should we be exploring or should we not be exploring, but I think that I would say, South Africa is highly dependent on imports today. And I do believe that if we were to explore for oil and gas offshore in South Africa, that will definitely change the game for South Africa. It could become a new sector in South Africa. And it also means that the future in this space, it's much more less emissions than you would have had in the past. And I definitely believe that if you have to find gas in South Africa, not just import gas, it will definitely change the game for the country.
From a tax perspective, how does government get that balance right between, on the one hand, increasing things like carbon tax so that, we are a sensible citizen in terms of our carbon footprint, while at the same time also being able to create a conducive environment for people who want to play in the oil and gas space because the resources are there and can be tapped on? How do you get that balance right?
So from a tax perspective, and again, what exists, especially within the upstream oil and gas sector, is the incentives that we spoke about. So for instance, it's possible to get a 200% deduction on capital expenditure under certain circumstances, or 150% deduction under other circumstances. So those incentives is what meant to drive and compensate for the long-term investment that is often required within oil and gas, and specifically within exploration. And then the other side of that coin, as you say, is our commitments to prevent climate change, and there it's really carbon tax that's been introduced. And I think this year again we'll see within the budget speech, in the announcements, some changes around carbon tax aimed essentially at increasing the tax, as that is the commitments that we've made. So I do foresee that carbon tax, for instance, will increase not only within the oil and gas, but of course across all industries and for all emitters.
Yeah. So we continue our conversation, although we do have 9 minutes before we're expecting the Minister of Finance, Enoch Godongwana, to deliver the budget speech. I will be listening in my ear to hear from colleagues whether he is going to make that walk into the Dome where he's going to be speaking. But for now, we continue our conversation. Aluwani, I wanted to ask you, not necessarily with your hat on as an oil and gas man or a downstream man, but really just as a South African, what is it that you want to come out of the budget in terms of, what we need to achieve as a country in terms of growth, while also balancing all the variables, the social aspects that we need to continue taking care of while we throw forward to a better future, lifting everyone's boat, so to speak?
That's always a tough question because, you have to, I said, the minister always has the tough job of spreading the love across the country, across everybody, making sure that everybody is taken care of. But I think we always have to think that the minister then also has to have a cover out of thinking about what is it that we're going to do to invest in the future so that the future is better than where we have been or where we are at the moment. And we often talk about, as a South African, I'd like to see more investment in network infrastructure in the country, because that's really what drives development. That's what drives investments, because it crowds in the investment that you need, and then it also means that then you can be able to create jobs and then be able to address some of the other social ills that you have. If you look at the decade that we've had with challenges around load shedding, it meant that it slowed growth from that perspective. With challenges that we've had in the ports, it has slowed growth on the other side. So if you really invest there where you can unlock things and then be able to get the mining to work, the energy sector to work, and other sectors can be able to work, then that's how you can be able to move forward. But definitely it's not about just doing that and forgetting that we actually need to get our kids educated. We need to get education right. And the other big focus area definitely has to be around crime. And we really have to address that, because that affects all of us collectively as a country.
Yeah. Ruben, one of the issues that is, of course, very important is issues around our industrial policy. And criticisms have been made around how effective our industrial policy has been, especially when it comes to the so-called special economic zones, where there's special incentives given for businesses to go and be productive there. And it seems as though that in many places that really hasn't been taken up. Is there an argument to be given to perhaps overhaul or tinker around that, because those are wasted incentives if they're not being used up to industrialize the economy?
Yeah, so it comes back to our conversation earlier around incentives and how effective they actually are. So within your special economic zone, for instance, you could have a reduced corporate tax rate of 15% as opposed to the 27%. And again, it's meant to drive certain behaviors which, as you say, may not have ultimately been achieved. Ultimately, what we have to look at is how do we broaden the tax base even further, and whether it's specific incentives that we give or not, but ultimately broadening the tax base is something that we need to look at. Not specific, I think, not specific industries or specific taxpayers, but looking at how we can broaden the tax base more generally, looking at incentives that don't necessarily cover a specific zone or a specific type of taxpayer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Aluwani, just in terms of looking at the growth picture, where else apart from oil and gas, you've talked about the network industries, where else do you see great potential for our economy for growth?
We have to join in on where the world is moving and going today, and it's really around technology. A couple of weeks ago, everybody was talking about DeepSeek and machine learning and AI and all these different things. So if you're to think about investing in the industries of the future, you have to be starting to think what is the kind of base that we're going to build for the country, and not only talk about the industries of the past, but think about the industries of the future. So you have to be starting to think about new incentives, about creating new industries that we don't even have today. And that is really where we need to be going in terms of the technology. And that can bring what people have been talking about, the great leap that Africa can essentially have in terms of the technology. But it means investments have to be made there.
Absolutely. Well, it's a huge challenge. Everything is about investment, but we need money to come from somewhere. And I think government has been very open and clear to say it doesn't have enough resources, and therefore there's been more conversation with the private sector. It's only just a few years ago where we had a situation where there was a lack of trust between the private sector and the public sector, or government, shall I say. But that has increasingly sort of changed. And there is greater dialogue. We're seeing initiatives, in terms of Operation Vulindlela, where government is looking to ensure that structural reforms take place to unlock economic backlogs and create a better pathway for economic growth, with the private sector also coming into areas like NECOM, which is basically, the energy sector, communications between government and the private sector, and the National Logistics Committee as well, which is also looking to fix the bottlenecks in areas like Transnet, the rail and port networks. So a lot of work is being done, but I think one of the issues that was raised by an economist we spoke to earlier was that these things take time. It's not at the flick of a switch where we're going to see things turn around, but it does look as though we're heading in the right direction. And we have had some positive comments from ratings agencies. One of them did turn around their view on South Africa, their outlook on South Africa, from stable to positive, which suggests that they're seeing that there's an improvement in the way things are looking in South Africa. We have the positive situation of our macroeconomic picture looking much better in terms of our inflation, with lower interest rates coming through, although not to the extent that we would all like. I think, of course, there are a few elephants in the room, a few risks that we have to face. There are external risks coming in the form of the United States and their tariff policies. There hasn't been any talk about tariffs being imposed on South Africa, but we have heard, of course, that some Republican senators are really pushing for South Africa to be withdrawn from the AGOA, that is the African Growth Opportunity Act. The opportunity that we have there is to export to the US market at very low or no duties at all. So there's talk about us being removed from that for various reasons. And then one then asks the questions, where to next? Could we then also be subject